Welcome to The Mything Link, a podcast where we explore the undercurrent of mythology that links our modern culture to our ancient stories.
We're your hosts, Dr. Caitlin
and Dr. Randall,
two professional mythologists who share a passion for music,
a proclivity for all things spooky,
and an insatiable curiosity for the world around us.
The show will cover worldwide mythology, and season 1 will focus on ancient Greek stories,
giving listeners everything they need to know to understand the new Netflix series Chaos,
and most likely several things that they don't. Join us as we talk, laugh, and sing this fall for The Mything Link season 1,
Chaos
Theory. You can link that up. It's appropriately chaotic. This whole situation is appropriately chaotic. Maybe that's it. It's a lesson in chaos. Perfect.
It's a lesson in chaos theory.
All right,
let's get this party started.
Hey.
Ha! Let's get it started here. What?
Welcome to The Mything Link. Today we're going to be looking at the story of the Minotaur. And in Chaos, we see this story played out with a few characters. Our girl Ariadne, is played by Layla Farzad. President Minos in Chaos, who is the parallel to King Minos in the mythology, he's played by Stanley Townsend. We have President Minos' wife, Pasiphae, played by Sheila Ami. They call her Pass in Chaos. We have the Minotaur, played by the British Egyptian actor Fadi El Sayed. We have Daedalus, portrayed by Matt Fraser, and Theseus, played by Daniel Lawrence Taylor. So today, Caitlin and I are going to explore a few different Greek and Roman tellings of the story of the Minotaur and King Minos. We also have the absolute joy and pleasure to talk to Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin. She is an art history professor at Fullerton College, so we'll play our interview with her a little bit later.
Per the usual, we have a content warning. This episode contains themes of sex, violence, bestiality, abandonment, the loss of a child, and murder.
And now let's go into telling the story.
The story is really interesting because it goes back to Minos and Pasiphae, his wife. Minos owes Poseidon a sacrifice for some reason or another, whether it's just because he was expected to sacrifice to Poseidon or to concretize his rule. He was demanded to sacrifice a bull that Poseidon had gifted him. The bull was so beautiful that Minos didn't want to sacrifice it, so he kept it for his herd and just sacrificed another bull. Of course, Poseidon knew, and he's pissed. So what he does is he curses Minos' wife, Pasiphae, to lust after this white bull that Minos had failed to sacrifice. And so she's entranced by this animal and goes to Daedalus and says, "Will you build me a contraption so that I can get close to this bull?" So he builds this wooden bull and covers it in bovine skin so she can actually mate with this white bull, and thus the Minotaur is conceived.
One of the versions I read said that King Minos was one of 3 brothers, and they prayed to the gods to see who would be worthy of leading the Minoans and being the heir to the throne. And they prayed to Poseidon, and Poseidon sent a white bull out of the waves, and the bull walked straight towards Minos. And so that's how they knew that he was the chosen one. And when Poseidon made this offering to them, he expected to get the bull back as a tribute. They expected him to sacrifice the bull, and Minos didn't.
Also interesting is that Pasiphae was taken to the Minoan Islands on the back of a bull who was actually Zeus. So that's how she got there in the first place.
Fuck that.
Should we tell the story of Theseus and the Minotaur?
Fuck Theseus. Okay,
Fuck
I do want to
Theseus.
say that Pasiphae, her name means light for all. And she was sometimes depicted as the goddess of witchcraft and sorcery. And she's a sister of Circe and the daughter of Helios, the sun god. And so she's a really powerful figure that I think very often gets kind of sidelined in this story of of a power struggle between Theseus and King Minos and the Minotaur and all these things. Like, she wasn't just some passive damsel in distress. So Daedalus was a famous sculptor and architect from Athens, and someone witnessed him murdering and burying his nephew because his nephew was so young and he became a better sculptor and architect than Daedalus. And in a moment of blind rage and jealousy, Daedalus pushed him off the cliff. And while he was burying his body, someone witnessed it and they sentenced him to exile. So he sought refuge in Crete, was fully accepted by King Minos because Minos had heard of the amazing works of Daedalus. And so he built the complex for King Minos and constructed the labyrinth underneath. And at Minos' request, made the corridors so confusing and dark that it was impossible for anyone down there to escape without the specific knowledge of how to get out.
In some versions, like you said, he has it built already, but in other versions, he has it built specifically to house the Minotaur.
Gosh, like how long would it take to construct a labyrinth that would hold such a beast? And like, what's the beast doing? I guess it's just a calf, a little baby calf,
A little baby. Oh, cute.
little cutie Minotaur.
Little cutie snug.
And I think it's important to note that, like, in Chaos, they showed Daedalus as being a prisoner of King Minos and like subjugated by him and forced to create these things that exactly like exploited his creativity and his genius. But canonically, like in the mythology, we don't really see Daedalus as being a prisoner of King Minos. Rather, he's being exiled from his homeland and is just looking for a place to land and finds almost that solace in King Minos and his culture.
Should we move over to Athens?
For Androgio, I've heard him called Androgio and Androgeus. There were two different versions of his name that I came across in my research. Androgeus or Androgio
was a son of Minos and Pasiphae, so a brother of Ariadne, and he goes to Athens on some sort of heroic journey, and there's a rampaging bull in Athens that kills him. Hearing that story, Minos doesn't believe it, and Minos is like, no, Athens literally murdered my son, my heir. And so he uses that to demand the 7 young men and women every 9 years or every 1 year, depending on what story you're reading. He uses that as leverage to subjugate Athens to Crete.
And since King Minos is the son of Zeus, Zeus directed all his fury onto Athens in retribution for killing his grandson. And then King Minos showed up, and the oracle at Delphi is the one who said, hey, Athenians, the only way to get rid of Zeus's fury is to give in to King Minos's demands. And so King Minos is like, all right, guess what? I got this crazy bull back at my place too. And now this is going to be the original Hunger Games. So then King Minos declared that for 9 consecutive years, 7 Athenian men and 7 Athenian women would be sent annually to feed the Minotaur, who had previously only been fed human flesh. Okay, so basically when we get to Theseus in Athens, he is our Katniss Everdeen, and he volunteers as tribute, specifically to go as a sacrifice to kill the Minotaur from the inside. So the hope is that he survives this, of course, right? And he doesn't have to sacrifice himself to kill the bull. But his father, King Aegeus, he said, all right, my son, like, I don't want you to go. This is the worst fucking idea you've ever had in your life, but you're a man, so you have the autonomy to make this decision for yourself. He allows him to go on one condition. He says, the ship we're going to send you to Crete on is outfitted with black sails, right? Because we are mourning the loss of these 14 young souls that are traveling out there. We're packing you a set of white sails. If you succeed, come home while flying those white sails so I know that you're safe. And so with this information, Theseus embarks on his journey.
So Theseus gets to Crete, and basically the stories go that Ariadne sees him and immediately falls into lust with this beautiful, heroic man. And so she wants him to survive and gives him this thread. that will enable him to, as he's walking through the labyrinth, he'll unspool the thread, and then after he's slain the Minotaur, he'll be able to follow the thread back out of the labyrinth.
I think it's important to note that in at least the versions that I read, this wasn't Ariadne's original idea. She wanted to save Theseus and wanted to ensure that he could succeed, because he basically told King Minos when he arrived, he told him what his plan was, and Minos agreed to it. Okay, if you kill the Minotaur, I won't require any tributes anymore. Good fucking luck. And Ariadne went to Daedalus and said, you constructed the labyrinth. You're the only one who knows how to escape. How can I help him escape? And it was Daedalus's idea to use the golden thread. He handed her the spool or the skein or whatever it was, handed her the thread and gave her the instructions. And then it was Ariadne who passed those instructions along to Theseus.
That was a good clarification.
Yeah, well, because of course Daedalus gets fucked for it at the end, so I want to make sure.
Yeah, that's fair.
We include. And Daedalus was such a huge, like, central character in Chaos. And I'm embarrassed to admit that was the first time I had heard his name, like, and remembered it. Like, of course I know this story, but the standouts are the Minotaur and Theseus, not the architect of the labyrinth. So that I really loved that about Chaos, that they gave him more of a central role.
Yeah, I do. I love that too. Also, in the myth, Ariadne says, I will help you, Theseus, if you promise to marry me and take me away from here. So she's fucking risking everything by giving him the yarn. She's helping a foreigner. She's denying the will of her father and making an autonomous decision, and banking her future on this dickhole who is trying to fulfill the stereotypical hero's journey and become king.
After Theseus succeeds in killing the Minotaur and making his way out of the labyrinth, he sails back to Athens with Ariadne, true to his promise. And my interpretation of the versions that I read were that Theseus is like, all right, Ariadne seems cool, but he's not like desperately in love with her the way she is desperately in love with him, right? And we don't know if Ariadne's desperately in love with who Theseus is, or more so what he represents, like an escape plan for her. So they're sailing back together, and on the way back, they stop at the island of Naxos to spend the night and hang out. And on that night, Dionysus appears to Theseus in a dream and professes his love for Ariadne and tells him, like, sorry, bro, she belongs to me. Leave her alone, please. And in some versions, Theseus and everybody else like gets on their boats and leaves, and Ariadne wakes up alone on this island, and she's super confused and doesn't know what to do. And Dionysus comes and marries her and promises to take care of her, but she's still pining and lusting after Theseus. So there's a lot we could do to fill in the blanks here, but I like to think maybe she had a good time with Theseus before he left her. I don't know, but we love a fuckboy, right?
We do love a fuckboy.
I'm just assuming they had a great time. She got dicked down and then he bounced, and Dionysus was her consolation prize that she didn't choose.
I literally, my notes wrote that Ariadne is a warning to all of us, don't trust a fuckboy.
Who sails in from out of town.
I know.
And promises
isn't really
to
that
fix all your problems, and he's just really not that into you. Ooh.
In Chaos, I like that we see her in relationship to Theseus. She's not like fawning and in love with him. She goes, I think I want to fuck him. You know, there's that female power of being able to be a sexually autonomous person, as obviously she has a crush
I don't even
on
remember
him.
Theseus.
Right. He was her bodyguard and he was in relationship with Anastaxes. He is literally a minor character.
Good. He should be. I mean, come on.
There's also versions where Theseus just forgets about her and sails away with her, and Dionysus like sees her abandoned on this island. In Ovid's version is where we see Theseus. He'd taken Ariadne with him, yet showed no pity. On that shore he left the faithful girl, and Ariadne wept till Bacchus came.
Bacchus, of course, is the Roman name for Dionysus.
Yeah. We've talked a little bit about their relationship in the Dionysus episode. They stay married.
They stay married, and every version I've read Dionysus is not like rapey and gross in the same way that the other gods are when they take wives. He seems to genuinely love her, even if in some versions she's kind of marrying him against her will. It doesn't have the same like undertones of rape that a lot of these other stories do, right? Like the against her will part is that she's still heartbroken over Theseus and not quite ready to move on yet, from my perspective, as opposed to her mother, right? Pasiphae, who is literally cursed by Poseidon to lust after this bull, right? So it's completely outside of her realm. But with Ariadne, we see a little bit more of a woman who perhaps is just out of options and just knows that she can never return home, right? She like almost turns into a version of Daedalus where she exiles herself. And rightfully so, because when we get back to Crete, we see that King Minos blames Daedalus for Theseus succeeding because he says, the only person who knows how to get out of that labyrinth is you, Daedalus. And so you had to have helped them. And what's interesting is Daedalus didn't help with any sort of insider knowledge. It was a really practical solution, a Hansel and Gretel type tale of marking your path so you could return the same way you entered. Contrasted with Chaos, where Daedalus is actively letting Ariadne into the labyrinth and her accomplice for all intents and purposes.
I think Ariadne in this story is an interesting figure because she's clever and quick thinking. She knows Daedalus will have a solution to help Theseus get out of the labyrinth. Like she has, almost a rational mind. Like she understands that guidance is needed to help Theseus get out of the shadow and through this. And she is somehow still portrayed as just the helper. She's not a protagonist in this story. Her intelligence is co opted and abused by Theseus for his own selfish, heroic means. Like her ingenuity is used for violence. She rebels against her father, which is a show of agency, right? Only to be abandoned on an island by Theseus, which is almost a stark reminder of, the patriarchal dominance and control. Like, there's a cost to female agency in a patriarchal structure. Her intelligence and creativity and rebellion lead to Theseus's success, but her own alienation and abandonment. She's kind of a tragic figure in that sense, right? Like, she went to Daedalus because she knew he would have an idea of how to help Theseus out, and she showed autonomy in that way. She showed rationality in that way. She showed intelligence in that way, and yet she's still damned. I mean, she's ultimately living the high life with Dionysus in the end, right? But like, she can never go back home. She's abandoned by the person that she wanted to help.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, don't so many of us have like the one who got away, right? Or that one that was like the best, most intense sex of our lives or emotional connection or whatever it was that for one reason or another just couldn't work out, right? I think this story really speaks to that experience, which is kind
Oh,
of,
yes.
yeah, like a universal human experience, right? And oftentimes it's due to circumstances outside of our control, whether the timing wasn't right or society wouldn't accept it, or you have to move for a job or school or whatever it is, like, or maybe they're just a hopeless depressed alcoholic and could never be the partner that you need them to be.
Or an emotionally unintelligent dick who's in love with somebody else, just wants to fuck your ass.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, all of those reasons. So in his journey back to Athens, as Theseus was sailing, he was so overcome with joy and excitement for killing the Minotaur, for succeeding in his quest, for saving the other tributes, for probably getting some from Ariadne, that in all the confusion and celebration, he forgot to change the sails on the ship. And as his father, King Aegeus, saw the ship coming back with the black sails up, he was so overcome with grief that from his vantage point, he threw himself off the side of the cliff into the ocean. And this was at Cape Sorion, where you could still visit today. And there's a little temple on top. And this is why that it's called now the Aegean Sea, from King Aegeus committing suicide in his grief. And unfortunately, he made that rash decision before he was able to even ask questions. It just, to me as a parent, I don't know, like, of course he was overcome with such intense emotion at even the thought of his son being gone. But God, to launch yourself off the cliffside before you even ask the people on the ship what happened, like, I would want to know personally, right? And that's my connection to the story. And of course, like we've discussed so many times, that's the tragedy of it, is it looks like it's easy to solve from the outside. But the tragedy is that we continue as humans to make these decisions that are often not in our best interests because we can't see the full picture. And our emotions sometimes get the better of us. We saw that with Daedalus already in this story. We see that again with King Aegeus.
In some versions of the story, it's just that Theseus doesn't change the sails fast enough. So, like, right after Aegeus throws himself into the Aegean Sea, they change the sails.
That just speaks to the futility of the human experience, right? And like the Captain Picard quote, sometimes we could make all the right decisions and still lose. And that doesn't mean anything except that we're human. So back on Crete, with Ariadne gone, the only person that King Minos could blame for the death of the Minotaur and the destruction of his whole system of oppression over the Athenians was Daedalus. And he came down hard on Daedalus for Theseus's victory. And he imprisoned Daedalus and his son in the labyrinth as retribution. And King Minos's wife, Pasiphae, she took pity on Daedalus. She really liked him. She really liked his son. She would go down and visit them. And there was a teeny tiny window way up high that nobody could reach, but was there for some airflow, for some sunlight, for whatever purpose Daedalus built it into the labyrinth, that at least gave them a little bit of something. And one day, Daedalus was looking out the window, daydreaming about how his life could be, and he saw a seagull flying by, and the sight of the seagull struck him with inspiration. So Daedalus then begged Pasiphae to bring him feathers, willow branches, cloth, and wax, so he could make him and his son wings to fly out of there. And she did. And Daedalus constructed 2 pairs of incredible wings. They put them on and they started flapping. And against all odds, those wings freaking worked. It raised them off the ground. They were able to fly out the window, both Daedalus and his son. And once they got outside, Daedalus realized, shit, we're on an island. The dew point is heavy. The marine layer is heavy. We have to make sure to fly high enough so these wings don't get weighted down by the water and the sea spray, but low enough so the wax doesn't melt from the sun. And as he called out this warning to his child, he was too late. His son Icarus had already flown high above the clouds, and the heat from the sun melted his wax, and his wings started to fall apart. And Daedalus watched in horror as Icarus flew higher and higher, just amazed by the novelty of freedom and the beauty of flight. And Daedalus's eyes searched the sky, and all he saw were a few feathers fluttering down, and he spotted his son's broken body below, washing up on the shores of an island. And Daedalus flew down, buried him under the tree on that island, and the land is now called Icaria in honor and memory of our Icarus.
I really like how Ovid words it. The boy had now begun to take delight in his audacity. He left his guide, and fascinated by the open sky, flew higher, and the scorching sun was close. The fragrant wax that bound his wings grew soft, then melted. As he beats upon the air, his arms can get no grip, they're wingless, bare. The father, though the word is hollow now, cried, "Icarus, where are you?" And that cry echoed again, till he caught sight of feathers on the surface of the sea. And Daedalus cursed his own artistry, and then built a tomb to house his dear son's body. It's really tragic and sad.
It's so tragic. And the Ovid retelling of this is so much more like tender and really, again, speaks to that futility of being a human. And I think more so than the Greek versions that I read. In the Greek versions that I read, it was more like a mistake. Icarus was young and he's just flying around and he couldn't hear his father's warnings. And in Ovid's version, his father sits him down and tells him what to do. Where I lead, that's where you fly. I'll be your guide. And he taught his son the rules of flight, fitted those wings on him. The old man worked and warned, his cheeks grew damp with tears, and with a father's fears, his hands began to tremble. And then he kissed his son. He would never embrace the boy again. And poised upon his wings, he flew ahead, still anxious for the follower that he led. Much like a bird who, from her nest on high, leads out her tender fledglings to the sky.
You're the most beautiful human. It's like stupid how beautiful you are. I can't even. Fucking best mom.
There's just so much more parental tenderness in this than just a random tragedy that happened when you're fleeing oppression, right? Like, it's the difference between reading a historical fiction about the American enslavement of African peoples versus reading something like Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Oh man, Toni Morrison's Beloved is...
I can't even get into that right now. But the knowledge in Ovid's version that Daedalus knows that Icarus isn't going to listen to him, but they have to try anyways. But Ovid just speaks so poignantly to the futility of being a parent, not just being a human, but being a parent, knowing that half the shit you say to your child is going to go in one ear and out the other, and you have to take the leap anyways, not knowing if or when you're going to land together. And it's so tragic. This is the first time I've cried while we were recording, I think. You cry all the time.
Leave me alone.
No, I love it.
Cry all the time.
I think it's beautiful. I don't know. I feel that was more of a burn on myself. Like, I get in these academic spaces and I'm able to talk about things without emotionally engaging with them. And the beauty of poetry that's thousands of years old that connects me to these parents, it's overwhelming.
It's really beautiful.
It's really beautiful.
It speaks to the beauty of mythology. It's
the
still...
beauty of mythology. Absolutely.
The story moves and changes, not just in itself, but in all of us, and moves and changes us.
In us, absolutely. Like, in my whole life, the story of Icarus, I related to Icarus because of course I'd want to fly too close to the sun. Of course I would want to be the biggest and the best and go the farthest and do as much as I possibly could. And that's what that story was about to me, of making sure I know my limits before I leap, right? Like, that's what it teaches us. And now to experience the story from the perspective of Daedalus is so different and so powerful. And I love how these stories just change and grow with me throughout my life. So beautiful.
Yeah, it is really beautiful.
I think it's really interesting that Chaos didn't include Icarus in this story, right? They let this story be Ariadne's and made it be like her futility and her desire to save her family that led to all of these things, that was the tragedy, the misinterpretation of the prophecy and the misunderstanding of fate, which are all very important takeaways as well. And I love what Chaos did with it. And they told this story of Daedalus a little bit out of order. Daedalus makes a reference to his son that he had lost in Chaos, which I thought was a nice little fun Easter egg. And of course, like we mentioned, Daedalus is already a prisoner when we meet him. But in the traditional myth, he's not imprisoned until after the Minotaur is killed.
Woo! You know, you talked about how, like, if they got into Medusa's story, it would take over the whole show.
Mm-hmm.
I think the emotion between Daedalus and Icarus would have been, you know, distracting from the emotion that they were trying to get at with the Minotaur.
Absolutely. Like, in the story of Theseus and the Minotaur, Daedalus is absolutely a supporting character, right? He's a central supporting character, but it's not his story until he makes his escape. And I understand why Chaos like wouldn't put that piece of it in, right? Like we discussed last week, if to tell the tale of Persephone is to have to tell the entirety of the canon of Greek mythology, and these stories aren't any different. right? But I love how they downgraded Theseus to a minor character and really gave this story to Ariadne. That was really beautiful to me.
I loved that as well. I also like really loved how they portrayed the Minotaur as a tragic figure, as a victim, as somebody punished for the fear of somebody else.
The fear of what could be, not even the fear of what is.
Right, exactly. In a lot of ways, I think the Minotaur is like a symbol of otherness, if you will, as a hybrid, to use Euripides' words. To see him is to confront our own notions of purity and identity, right? Like his monstrousness can represent, almost does represent our fear of the other, our fear of the unknown. And it's that fear that consumes our humanity in a lot of
Absolutely.
ways.
Like, think of the way you said that made me think of this idea that the labyrinth is scary regardless of whether you've seen the Minotaur or not. And even just the suggestion of the Minotaur's presence, right? This taps into that base human fear of the unknown, of the unseen, of the hidden corners that we don't have experience with. Especially these Athenians were brought in as cultural outsiders, knowing that they're making their way towards certain death. And to enter the labyrinth with that knowledge, there doesn't need to be a Minotaur in there, right? Like, we'll punish ourselves enough based on our fear of what could be in there. So I think that if we're looking at this story literally, and if this literally did happen at some point, could there have been just a bull down there? Could there have been nothing down there that people just, it was so scary? And look at like the modern retelling of the Hunger Games, right? The people are killing each other to survive. So perhaps like that monster is just the monster inside of us all that's lurking in the dark corners of our mind and can be unleashed at any time. And that suggestion and that fear that we manufacture intrinsically is often far more powerful than any external monster that we would ever come into contact with.
I really like the way that you said that.
I think also the labyrinth would represent like the shadow self and like the confusion and the loss and the darkness that is existing just beneath our feet. And we talked about this last week when we talked about Hades and Persephone and the underworld existing just barely thinly separated from the world of the mortals in ancient Greek stories. And I think the labyrinth can really be representative of that, especially if the story comes to us from a pre-Greek tradition where they don't necessarily have like the full concept of the underworld in the way that we would understand Hades' domain today.
It's also could be reflective of just, the human condition, the human experience, the human mind. The human mind is a dark place to go if you're not in community, if you don't have guidance, if you don't have help. And the only way that Theseus is able to get back out is because somebody else lent him their intelligence and innovation and creativity. And I think to me, it's a very poignant example of how we are not meant to be alone. Like, I really relate to the idea of the mind as the labyrinth because of how my own mind works. And like, if Randall hadn't handed me the thread, I would still be fucking lost in there half the time, right?
And who better to build the labyrinth than Daedalus, someone who had been exiled from his homeland and cursed to never again see the people and the places and everything that he loved. And so this could be like an external representation of those dark corners that he's now experiencing, being a cultural outsider and coming to this place.
In that, I also think it could represent, like, you know, the motherfucking systems of injustice, right? Like, Minos created this thing specifically to oppress other people and keep them trapped in his own power. He actively takes victims and actively has a victim constantly imprisoned in this labyrinth that he has his castle on top of. I think it's a way to exemplify systems of power keeping the less fortunate entrapped in the dark and at the whim of rulers and violence.
Which is a hellacious experience for all those trapped in it, but it also takes all the unwanted and puts them out of sight and makes it appear like society is functioning better than it actually is.
Fuck him, fuck Theseus, fuck Perseus, fuck Zeus,
Fuck them all.
fuck them all.
I do want to bring up that the bulls that we're talking about that would have existed during Bronze Age Crete. Like this was largely a prehistoric culture. So most of what we have that survives from them are the frescoes, are the art. There was some writing that they developed later on in their society that was likely based off of Egyptian hieroglyphics. They wrote in linear A and B, I want to say. I don't think I wrote that down. So when we're talking about the Minoan culture, civilization, this spans like from about 3000 BCE all the way up to about 1400 BCE, which is a huge span of time, about 1500 years. So during this time, they went from a society with no written record to then developing a linear A script that was based on ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, and then evolved into linear B, which was then utilized by the Mycenaeans and turned into an early form of Greek writing. So the Minoans are the earliest example of civilization we have of Europe. Obviously, first civilization is in the Fertile Crescent, but that's technically like a fusion of Europe and Asia. And so this is like the first European culture that we have reference to. It had the first roads in Europe. It had the first flush toilets in Europe. And these bull leaping frescoes, they depict bulls that have long since been extinct. And there's actually a rewilding effort right now in Europe for a version of this bull. Absolutely amazing. They're called aurochs, and they were the largest terrestrial mammal in Europe at the end of the last ice age. And they're the wild bull from which all of our modern day cattle are descended from. And we see depictions of these aurochs as well in the Lascaux cave system, dating from about like 40,000 BCE. Absolutely incredible.
Glad you brought up bulls, because I think that bulls are a really interesting symbol in almost all ancient historic cultures. The bull is generally a positive symbol. Like what Randall just said, its domestication enabled humans to get sufficient food and form communities, right? So generally it's a very revered creature. It was associated with wealth and abundance, and sheer life force and tenacity is usually ideas that are associated with the bull. So like in ancient Greece, for example, bulls were revered and worshipped for their generative power. So bulls are also typically associated with virility and fertility, strength, determination, perseverance. So the story of the Minotaur and the bull being an almost negative symbol is really fascinating to me. It's interesting that bulls are traditionally a positive figure in like sweepingly most cultures.
When we're talking about animals, I just want to be very clear here. The bulls are the male of the bovine species. Bovine or cattle are gender neutral terms. Bull specifically refers to the male and cow refers to the female.
So that said, something you said reminded me of this. I think the Minotaur can also be a symbol of the conflict between human rationality and like our primal instincts, the duality of difference in all of us. You know, Freud would say that the Minotaur represents our repressed desires and fears that we lock away, you know, our suppressed taboo desires. But I think the Minotaur represents, we talked about this a little bit with Persephone, but like the dark, untamed aspects of ourself, like of human nature, they have a place, a necessary place in life. And when we lock them away, like Randall was just talking about, they develop into these horrible, flesh consuming fears. We have to address and integrate the duality in all of us. We need to accept that tension and integrate it into ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about that integration, this move towards, I mean, that's like part of the individuation process, right? And part of the hero's journey, all of these things, like we realize that we can't do these things on our own. And like we even see that in a hero story like Theseus, that he depends on the help of those around him. And Ariadne can't help Theseus alone either. She depends on the help of Daedalus, and Daedalus can't stop King Minos from his systems of oppression until Theseus and Ariadne are in place, right? It takes all of these players working together against a system of oppression. And that's why community is so important and dangerous. That's why, to bring it back to enslavement in the American South, I don't want to call them slave masters because they're not masters of anything but fucking shit and garbage and hell. But the people who enslaved Africans, they made sure to populate their plantations with people from different cultures who spoke different languages to make sure that they could never communicate enough to rise up and fight this system of oppression, which of course they did over and over and over and over again, right? Because like the story of Babylon tells us, we don't need to speak the same language in order to work together. And sometimes that's a downfall if we over communicate.
That makes me think that in my mind, the Minotaur is a victim, right? It's something that was birthed of and punished for its parents' sins. It was never given a chance. From the get-go, it was seen as retribution for a repercussion of Minos' hubris, and it's never given a chance. And it's isolated and demonized because it's different. And so it lives this life of loneliness where it's constantly experiencing the cruelty of being forced to be alone and having others terrified of it and experiencing this intense lack of compassion. And I think Chaos really gets at this. How would it know anything other than violence and loneliness? And how would it know how to appropriately use its strength if it's not ever in contact with community and love, right? The whole idea in Chaos is that the Minotaur is a monster because it's kept alone and isolated and by itself.
Right? Like, does evil actually exist, or is it created? Is it nurtured? I would argue that it's created. I don't think it's something that's inherently present in our natural systems. It comes from people being out of sync with natural systems, right? From exile, from loneliness, from not being allowed to be in community with others.
Or like, it's not canon, if you will, but you could, like we were talking about with Medusa and this idea that she was just a powerful, misunderstood woman with locks and she's othered because she's different. You could argue the same of the Minotaur, right? Like, what if he was just the son of Minos and Pasiphae who had some sort of differing ability, and he's isolated and alienated and, kept in the dark because he is different. He is other. And instead of including him, they lock him away. And I don't know, I think he's a really tragic figure. Like, I feel
Absolutely
sad for him.
Right. And I love how in Chaos, they turned him into the victim that he has always been in this story.
Oh,
Well,
yeah.
from our cultural perspective, right? He's the victim of this
I
story.
fucking love how Chaos depicted the Minotaur. And so that brings me to, like, I think my own final point, because I'm like losing the ability to not cry. So there's like, the typical interpretations of the story where Theseus is doing the typical hero's journey bullshit and he conquers the shadow self and navigates the shadow to get the girl and become the king and, yada, yada, yada. All that stereotypical patriarchal bullshit that we don't love over here. But I like to think of Homeboy as he's the anti-hero in this story, in my opinion, right? He's a fucking dick. He kills the victim in this story and then abandons his partner. He abuses Ariadne's craftiness for his own advantages and then abandons her. Fuck Theseus. Fuck the hero's journey. He's a fucking dick. I don't want to hear the arguments about, like, Theseus navigating the shadow self and integrating the shadow self into his mind so he, like, finishes the individuation process. No, I don't want to hear any positive twists on his character because he is gross. Okay, that's not fair. I do want to hear them. I'm just actively going to speak against them because it does not align with my worldview.
Right. And that's okay. And also, like, I think we have an even more intense rejection of these masculine hero stories because we're raised just completely inundated with them, right? And so we're trying to swing wildly in the other direction. So I don't think it's that there's no room for a hero or there's no place for masculinity or whatever that is. Like, we're not misandrists over here, but we're ready for a different story. We're ready for more types of stories to gain traction, right? There's more than one way to be a hero, and there's more than one way to serve your community.
And killing victims and abandoning women is not the way to do it. There's definitely like positive stories of masculinity in Greek mythology.
Like, look at Daedalus. I think he's such a positive masculine role model. He's using his
Dionysus.
creativity. Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I think the reason that I'm so aggressively against these traditional tellings of these stories is because, like Randall said, I need a new paradigm. I'm tired of this paradigm. I want healthy visions of masculinity. I want, you know,
Yeah, absolutely. It's not that there's no place for masculinity. It's that we want stories of healthy, non-toxic masculinity, right?
the
Like,
stories we have are patriarchal. They're toxic masculinity. They're toxic white masculinity flavored in the way that we've heard them. No thanks. I'm tired of that story. I've
me
been
too.
oppressed by that story my whole life.
Yep. And we're lucky enough to be born as white women in this country, in the United States today. And there are levels of intersectionality and levels of oppression. And we absolutely enjoy levels of white privilege that we did not earn. And it's just the world that we're walking through. And we also are subject to different layers of oppression as women, as educated women.
I
That's who
want
we are in
better
life.
for all of us. I think Randall and I mean, it's easier said than done, but like, put us on the fucking chopping block if it means everybody else gets a better life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Today, we are super excited to have a fun guest with us, Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin. She is an art history professor. Her PhD is in art history with a specialization in Latin American art and a minor in ancient indigenous art. And she is also the host of the series Art Trippin', which we will link to her TikTok and YouTube and Instagram in our show notes. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you so
Woo!
much for having me. Woo!
Thank you for joining us. I'm especially excited to have you on today because we're doing the story of the Minotaur, and I have been lucky enough to visit the palace at Knossos, and I was with Megan when I did it, and that is how we met. So, would you like to speak a little bit on yourself and what you're about?
I am an art history professor. I teach at a community college in California. And as you mentioned, my PhD work is in Latin American art history, and I do teach that. But I also teach the Western art history surveys because that's the nature of life at the community college. And yes, we did meet. I had brought students with me on a trip, and we were in Italy and Greece, and we went to Crete. And we got to visit the archaeological site and the museum. And for me, like the museum was a revelation. Just
Oh my gosh, that museum.
the sheer quantity of objects that those people made, and the playfulness of the style. Like one object that I always remember that I'm like, I need to have this in my house one day was a ceramic bathtub, and on the inside of the bathtub it was painted with all of these fish. So the idea is like when you're taking the bath it feels like you're in the sea, you know. And I'm just like, that these people knew how to live. These people knew.
Absolutely. The piece that I remember sticking out the most was a jar, like a
Mm,
vase with an octopus on it.
yeah.
Like, oh my gosh. I'm I mean, I like art. I'm a human who likes art, but the Minoan art specifically, here's the octopus.
Yes, that's the famous one that's like in all the art history survey courses. And in
Yes.
fact, I've got some Minoan ladies behind me, and you can see these like curving, graceful lines of their hair. Like that's sort of what the octopus tentacles are like. And that's characteristic of the art form of these people, are these like really organic, kind of sinuous, curving lines. And it's a very graceful art style. As you,
Absolutely. And their hands, like you're doing that.
yeah.
I
And
can't even be that graceful.
these people were around thousands of years ago, like thousands of years before, you know, the ancient Greeks. Like they are really ancient people. I just want to tell your listeners about Art Trippin'. Art Trippin' is me living my truest self and living out my heart's desire and talking about art and traveling. And I'm doing that on TikTok. On TikTok, I make really kind of short videos about art history topics that are related to art from all time periods and like all over the world. And I do have some videos about Minoan art as well. And then my YouTube channel, which is still in development, I actually was on sabbatical last year and I went to Italy and traveled all around and filmed a whole bunch of content to make like 10 episode series art tripping in Italy and talking about art and food and meeting with locals and talking to artists and talking about culture, and especially kind of like those elements of culture that like people are keeping alive, people are like keeping traditions alive, and kind of off the beaten track destinations. So we do go to like Rome and Florence and Venice, but we also go to small towns. We go to Bologna, where I studied abroad. We go to like some smaller towns around Italy. So it's forthcoming. I have like thousands of hours of footage recorded, and it just needs to be edited together into a series. But my dream is to have it like to have my own travel series on like HBO, because then I could curse, and like
Right?
about sex and like I love art history, but I also like to be a bit irreverent with it, because it can be really kind of a stuffy
Mhm,
field, but
mhm.
actually people are messy and history is messy and much more interesting than the history books let on. So,
Well,
um,
you're in the right place.
yeah.
We curse on our podcast. Every episode that we've released so far has had to be tagged for explicit content. And you can't talk about mythology without talking about like the worst parts of the human condition along with the best, right? And like art, does life imitate art, or does art imitate life? And obviously it's both. And so we're going to have the bad and the good as well. Well, I'm so glad you're here. I also share a similar dream. I wish I could just have a travel show where I talk about mythology and lead people. I really want to make sure we bring up, you have an upcoming tour to Italy in June that
Yes.
folks can sign up for.
Yes.
And you also use a women led local Italian company, which I absolutely love.
Well, I did last year. I used like this women owned and a local company. That was my thing, was like I didn't want to be like putting money into this like big corporation that like is not rooted in the place. My friend who was the owner of that company passed away. So this year I'm kind of doing it on my own, like kind of taking what I've learned from her. And I mean, I have a lot of contacts. I lived in Italy 3 years. I speak the language. I know a lot of people there. Like I can make it work, but I'm sort of doing it without her this year for the first time.
That's tough.
What can you do? But I do have a tour coming up in June 2025. We're doing North Italy. We're like kind of the north of Italy. We're going to Venice, and we're going to like see all the art, all the history. And then we're gonna go to Lago di Garda, which is kind of like everybody goes to Lake Como, but like Garda is like a little maybe off the beaten track.
Very cool.
And then we go to the Dolomites, to the mountains. So if
Ooh.
people want to go hiking and that kind of thing, there's like beautiful lakes and the air is really fresh and clean.
God, I could use some fresh, clean air.
I know. I know. I live in Long Beach, California. Like the air is not clean here. So.
Mhm. All right. So, a couple things I want to ask you about. I came across in my research on Minoan art. I guess first we should say that the Minoans didn't call themselves Minoans. That was bestowed upon them by Sir Arthur
Sir Arthur
Evans.
Evans.
Yes, it was our good old friend Heinrich Schliemann who chose the spot to excavate at the Palace of Knossos, which he famously is the one who also identified where the city of Troy is.
Yeah.
And as a professionally trained archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann like makes me a little anxious in my body because he was mostly a treasure hunter and he like destroyed half of what he touched. But also he was this fabulously independent, wealthy man who had the resources and the drive to find these places and uncover like the fresco behind you and bring all this amazing stuff to us. So in my research, I came across this idea that the Minoans might have been a matriarchal culture based on the art that has been found.
Could be. I mean, that we don't necessarily have any evidence that says that for sure, but it could be. I mean, one thing that you notice when you look at the art is a prevalence of depictions of women, sort of elegant women. You do see men depicted in the art, but a lot of times they're sort of engaged in tasks like fishing or like carrying wine, bringing wine, these kinds of things. And there are lots of depictions of this snake goddess or maybe this priestess. So, there definitely was a cult to a female deity. We could say that. Does that mean that there were not other deities, not really, but it could have been that there was this strong female deity. And it could have been a culture where women had more power than maybe in other parts of the ancient world. I guess we could say it like that, but we don't know for sure. And then there's this famous room that's like the queen's bathroom, the one with the
Like
dolphin,
with the dolphins.
the dolphin fresco, and that room. So, and we have, kind of evidence of, I guess, women being together in these small groups and like sort of tending to each other, and also being attended to by men that are like coming towards them, bringing wine and things like this. There's a lot of kind of celebratory imagery in a lot of Minoan art. Not as much kind of militaristic imagery. I mean, there's, some, we know that they were seafarers. They were great, going across the sea, and they were known throughout the ancient world for their ceramic work too. They found Minoan ceramics in ancient Egyptian tombs, this kind of thing.
Yeah, and Crete is the biggest island
Yes.
in what we would call Greece these days. And it is about 150 miles long and only about 3 miles wide at its widest point. So relatively speaking, it's a pretty small landmass, but for an island in that area, the mainlanders referred to it as the Big Island, which
I mean, it's
love.
the biggest island. I mean, there's some tiny little islands all, across the way. All of the Cycladic islands are tiny compared to Crete. Crete's like, it's almost like the mainland of the islands.
Right, right.
But it's really well positioned, like it's in that kind of southern Aegean Sea. So they're linked to Greece and also kind of North Africa. Like it's a really strategic position. We don't really know how they ended up, but probably the Mycenaeans came and took over. And in a lot of the Mycenaean art, we see lots of depictions of soldiers and warfare and like a much more militaristic culture. And so like maybe we're making a lot of assumptions and saying like, well, this culture seems more peaceful and less militaristic, so therefore maybe women were in charge. Like we're kind of making an educated guess. There's not really any evidence necessarily of that.
Well, sure. I mean, like 90% of archaeology is making educated guesses, right?
Yeah, so you can't understand a whole culture from like one facet. But, there are lots of images of what appear to be like a Pacific life where people are swimming and, drinking wine and I don't know, like eating olive oil and, living the good life really on this island, living well, it appears. Or maybe that is what it looks like to our modern eyes. There's evidence of this villas out in the countryside, like, it was a wealthy culture. And there were like fertile lands and they had these ceramics and, olive oil and all of these things. So there was something worth taking for the Mycenaeans.
Absolutely. And Crete's not a walled island. There is no like military structures found. And so archaeologists' best guess is that they were such a powerhouse that nobody really fucked with them.
Could be, yeah.
Could be. I like to think that perhaps the Minoans date to about 3000 BCE to about 1400 BCE, give or take. And I like to think that since they predated the ancient Greeks, like maybe that's where we got our story of Atlantis from.
Yeah, it could be.
Like this like strong, peaceful, artistic island nation that was lost to time. And it was lost to time for so long until I think the excavation was 1900.
Yeah, I mean, it was like 100 years ago, in the last 100 years, Sir Arthur Evans. But Sir Arthur Evans like also invented a lot of things. And there's probably things that we say today that are incorrect, but we're just sort of repeating some of those things that Sir Arthur Evans, decided in the moment. Like he had decided that he had found the labyrinth of the Minotaur. And this is where we get this term Minoan. I mean, these people, there was another name. We don't know what they call, but Sir Arthur Evans said, well, this must be the palace of King Minos. And so these are the Minoans.
And one of the reasons why he believed that were the bull leaping frescoes that were uncovered at Knossos. What's the difference between a fresco and another piece of art? Why do we call them that?
Well, okay, a fresco is when you paint with pigment. And, pigment is something taken from nature, like from rocks and minerals and things, ground up into a powder and then mixed usually with some water. And then to make a fresco, this pigment and water is painted directly into wet plaster. So as it hardens, like it becomes part of the wall, versus like a mural is just sort of painting on a wall. But I want to go back to this thing that you said, because you said this thing about the bull leaping fresco. This is kind of another thing that people use as evidence of sort of like women being in charge. The traditional interpretation of the bull leaping fresco is that there are women, and these women are kind of watching and perhaps even directing the action, but the men are partaking in the leaping over the bull. So some people interpret this as like the men were like entertaining the women, or like doing this somehow under the direction of the women. But that's based on an interpretation of the figures in the image that might not even be correct. A lot of art historians say that the people that are depicted with pale skin are female and the people with the darker skin are male. But if you look at all Minoan art, this is not always true. So is that really what's happening?
Some of the interpretations of the bull leaping, the best one I read said something along the lines of a bull is going to charge because that's what bulls do, and the humans are going to leap because we can choose to. And this idea that the ancient Greeks would later call hubris, right? And Caitlin and I, a couple episodes ago, were talking about a specific sect of Protestantism where they handle snakes. That shows their faith in God. And perhaps this bull leaping could have been something similar, right? Where you're like demonstrating your power over nature or your bravery or virility or whatever it is by participating in a ritual such as this. Or maybe it's just a modern day rodeo and it helps the dudes get laid,
And why not both? Like, couldn't it be doing both too?
Absolutely.
I mean, it could be. I always just sort of thought that it was a show. That's just kind of how I always saw it. But I always thought that the snake goddess images, like they were doing something. That was not just a show. Like they were communing with the divine in those moments. There's that really famous one of the lady holding up the snakes and her eyes are sort of in this trance, right? And that we saw that in the museum. And
and she has great boobs too.
Oh yeah, well they wore this like kind of corset, like
Yeah,
with around their waist, and then they just let their titties be free. Oh, what a way to live.
if only.
Yeah, what a way to live. And the thing that was interesting at the museum when we were on the island of Crete, I didn't realize that there were like thousands of those snake
goddesses.
Like just the repetition, like the sheer quantity of sculpture that survived is astounding, especially things made out of terracotta, like huge, those bathtubs and some of these goddesses, these huge vases and like
and some of the vases had bodies in them, huge vases that fit a human to bury and do funerary rites in these vases.
I mean, the bull leaping, it could be, sure, it could be a ritual, but definitely these snake goddess ladies, whether they're goddesses or priestesses dressed up as a goddess, they are doing something ritualistic. I mean, they could just be sort of showing off their, I don't know, control of the snakes, maybe. And I read something that said that the Minoans kept snakes around their houses on the outside because the snakes ate the rodents and would keep rodents out of the house. And apparently there are like 2 or 3 snakes that live on this island because it's an island, right? So there's like, what do you call it? I don't know, like biological, I don't know what, they're separated from the mainland. So there's only like 2 or 3 snakes that live there.
Right.
And they're not poisonous. None of them were poisonous. So they just let the snakes be around.
There are 4 types of snakes on Crete, and none of them are dangerous to humans. The Balkan whip snake, a cat snake, a dice snake, and a leopard snake. Well, that's fun because I was thinking that these snakes like definitely functioned like house cats if they're keeping the rodents away.
I have a leopard snake tattoo. They kept the snakes around and the cats too because they would keep the rodents away. But also a snake is a symbol of transformation, like a very powerful symbol of transformation.
Yeah, and snakes are something we've talked about a few times this season so far, but they're such an interesting symbol, both of renewal and regeneration because of the skin that they shed. And also, do you know that female snakes have a split clitoris that matches the split snake's tongue?
Shut up. I did not know that.
Yeah, I'll link
There's
this
a-
book in our show notes. This is from the great book of symbols, of archetypal symbols. And it specifically says that snake's gender is determined by the temperature of its surroundings during gestation. And males have split hemipenes, which means a forked penis. A hemipene.
Hemipene.
And females have a split clitoris, relating these parts to the tongue and the imagery of seduction in paradise. In the mythology of King Minos, his daughter is Ariadne, and she's the one who helps Theseus make his way out of the labyrinth, right, with the golden thread. But Dionysus claims her as his mortal lover. And so Theseus leaves her on an island, and Dionysus comes and marries her. And Dionysus's symbols are typically like a leopard and a snake. And oftentimes they're depicted together. And obviously, the temple at Knossos predates any stories of Dionysus that we're aware of. But of course, like they could have been circulating in the oral tradition before then, and absolutely could have been around.
That story of Ariadne helping Theseus and then fleeing. I mean, she has to flee, right? Because she's
her dad will
betrayed
kill
her
her.
father. Yeah, she's betrayed her father. So like family is over. And they stop on the island of Naxos on the way back. And that's where Ariadne gets left. And there in some of the stories, it's sort of portrayed as like Theseus abandoning her. Because he was just like, he got what he wanted and he was done with her. And then in other versions of the story, Dionysus is like, kind of takes her from him. And it's you see this depicted in art history a lot.
Of Ariadne being left on Naxos?
Yeah, or waking up. I'm thinking of these depictions of her like sort of waking up from her slumber to like find herself alone on the island of Naxos. Like this is frequently depicted in sort of Renaissance and Baroque art history. And so I had always interpreted it as like she was abandoned by Theseus, but in some versions of the story, Dionysus, kind of forced Theseus to like give her up to him,
In the version that I read, it wasn't, Theseus didn't need a lot of convincing. He seemed to just be like, hey, this chick is hot and she helped me out.
Yeah.
Where Ariadne is the one who was like, oh my gosh, look at this man and all his glorious manhood. I must help him and I must figure it out.
There's also versions where she's already promised to Dionysus before she even meets Theseus. And so he's required to give her back to him.
He was just like a pit stop on the way. Maybe she just wasn't into the Minotaur situation. Maybe she was over it and she wanted to peace out. She was like, I'm out of here. Bye.
Yeah, you're my ticket off this godforsaken island. Get me out of here.
I also, in my research, stumbled across the idea that it's very possible that Ariadne was actually like one of the female bull jumpers or participating in the bull jumping in some way. And because the Greeks were both patriarchal and xenophobic, they like retold her story to be like more appropriate to Greco-Roman ideals because they didn't know how to relate to like female empowerment, right?
An empowered woman. I mean, in fact, like we know this about the Greeks from looking about how they write about the Etruscan women, that Etruscan women had so much independence, so much power. They could own objects independent of their husbands. They could go to the wine parties and talk to other men that were not their husbands. They could engage in sports and music. They could do all sorts of things that the Etruscan men could do. The Greeks were just like, who are these people? They're out of their minds giving women so much power. They couldn't conceive of it. So they probably, did the same thing to Ariadne. And Ariadne gets kind of erased out of the story as if she's non-essential, that like it was all Theseus through his might to defeat the Minotaur. And it's like he literally couldn't have done it without her. Like he would be in there lost, you know?
Yeah, he may have been able to kill the Minotaur, but he would have wasted away in the labyrinth.
He would have starved. How would he get back out, you know? And like he's erased from these stories because the Greeks don't understand, you know, how to talk about a woman who's empowered.
That's what I really liked about her depiction in Chaos. I really loved their treatment of Ariadne, giving her the agency, giving her the autonomy and the power. And like, she's the one who like perpetuates the action and drives the plot. And then also Dionysus is like, within her storyline, Dionysus is a minor character who's just sitting there watching, and you could just see him. You could see his boner developing, like, oh fuck.
He goes, I think I'm in love.
I think I'm in love.
Yeah. And that's why, because she was an empowered woman, you know, and the Greeks can't conceive of that. So they just tell her as somebody who gets abandoned and passed around by these men. They're basically just like, slut, you know.
Passive damsel in distress, like, rescue me from my father's kingdom. My father is an evil monster and only you can defeat the Minotaur. Like, come on.
We have to remember that sometimes we're like taking in all of these, like the Greek inability to imagine an empowered woman. We're like,
yeah, and we're also approaching it from our own modern cultural context as well. And we were raised with these stories of damsels in distress, our Gothic heroines, our fairy tale princesses, right? They're so passive, and that, like, of course, has been filtered and retold through these patriarchal systems over and over and over and over again until we are in the spot where we are today.
Eve, autonomous woman making decisions for herself.
yeah,
Damned.
we have experiences that go totally against all of these stories, and we're like, now wait a minute. Maybe all of that was not correct.
Maybe the person who comes across a dead woman in a glass coffin in the middle of the forest and immediately fucks her is the villain and not the hero of the story. Maybe the guy who climbed up a tower and found a woman under a curse sleeping and then fucked her so many times, raped her so many times that she became pregnant and she woke up actively becoming a mother and missing out on that transition from her maidenhood to her motherhood and getting that forcibly taken from her while she's unconscious. That's a fucking villain in my book. I get these rants about the heroes. I fucking hate the heroes.
Well, then you have people like fucking Brock Turner who rapes a girl who's unconscious behind a dumpster and gets to walk fucking free because they don't want him to lose his swimming scholarship or whatever. Like, we've heard these stories so many times that, like, yes, of course he's walking free.
We know our place in the story.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, they can become president.
Sure can.
Mic drop. Twice.
All right.
Yay.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate having you on here today.
Thank you. That was fun.
We love your perspective, and you're the first non-mythologist we've had as a guest. So this was
fun.
a special little thing.
Special.
Yeah. This was really fun.
I love
took notes.
spending time with like-minded fellow oracles and goddesses.
Here's a final question. Do you think that the Minotaur had a human peen?
A man penis or a bull penis?
A man peen?
God,
yeah, or like did he just have like an overly large man peen because he was part bull? What do you think?
I guess it depends on what part of him was bull. He's traditionally portrayed as just the head of a bull and the body of a man, so I would say man. But like if we're talking about a centaur, I would say a centaur definitely has a horse cock.
Yeah.
Because of the part of the body that is, right? Like, yeah.
But if he's, they say that he's like half of each, right? Like, what does that mean? Does he have like,
I would
the reason
think
I'm
like
curious is because if he has
bigger
bull
and
DNA,
stronger.
Yeah. So maybe
does he ejaculate Red Bull? Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm just wondering, like, if he's a big man, like he's got the head of a bull, he would need to be able to support that with his body. So he's probably like hung just to be proportionate. I don't know.
Not everything always anatomically lines up, but I would say that probably.
I'm just thinking in terms of like the bull DNA, I've been thinking about it all morning.
And that white bull knew what he was doing.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
He was not tricked by that wooden. He was not tricked by that wooden bull. He knew.
Also, like, okay, have you ever seen a horse peen? They're fucking huge.
Like, they're unmanageable.
Right. That's what I'm saying. How did this woman? I mean, I guess I've seen people use like those dragon dildos or whatever, but you have to like work up to that, I feel like. You know, you can't just like walk up to a bull and be like, hey, like lift your leg, right? It's not just gonna
Well,
like
King
go
Minos
in.
is the son of Zeus, so he's probably like well endowed by the gods.
On that note, love you.
Woo! Love you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Mything Link. You can find the reference list in the show notes for further research. The Mything Link is researched and recorded by Drs. Randall Oliate and Caitlin Curry. Edited by Dr. Caitlin Curry. With music by Mark Austin Kelton. The Mything Link is produced by Fernweh Collective Incorporated, a humanities nonprofit based in San Diego, California. As a small nonprofit, we appreciate if you have the time to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help grow our audience. For more information on our organization, head over to fernwehcollective.org. Thanks for listening.
Whoop. Meow.